In part 3 of this asset creation video on the intro to procedural surfacing in Designer, we will export our surface textures and use the Heightmap in Blender to generate detailed geometry. So once you've kind of gone through and added all the different features to replicate the surface that we're trying to create, as I've done here, to make this kind of dirty, kind of anti-slip floor tile that probably be seen around a lot of transit areas or subways and things like that, we can start to export these textures. Now, before I do that, one thing you might notice about Substance Designer is sometimes the 3D view here will look a little bit blurry or not that detailed. And this isn't so much a problem when you're just figuring out the basic shapes, but starts to be an issue when you start to focus on details. So one thing that you can do to fix this, and it's something that I find quite important, is up here under Edit, Preferences, you'll find under 3D View, there's this Viewport Scaling set to Auto. Turn this to None or Off, and by doing that, it might be a little bit slower, but you're going to get a much sharper look of your materials here, and I find that to be crucial to doing a lot of detailing. So I think that's something that you should definitely probably turn off if you're able to, because it does help you focus on the details that you're adding. So once you have your material maybe ready for export and you want to save it out, you can just go in here to your graph and you can right click on your graph in the Explorer and you can export outputs as bitmaps. Now, if you're saving like a hard copy of this for, future use in many different aspects, games, film, anything, you might want to save it as EXRs or something because they have the full range of the image. But if you're saving it specifically for Unreal or something, maybe you'd want to put it as like a PNG or a Targa. It doesn't really matter. Most game engines are going to convert the image anyways to their own format. EXR probably it's the most heaviest. You probably wouldn't want to use it for games, but it's good to retain all the data that you've created. So for now, I'm just going to save it as that. But for games, you probably want to save it something different, something less heavy. But I always keep my backups as EXR format, so they have all the original range that they were exported with. So you're not losing data on export. You kind of get the full range of values that you have here. So now we can export these out. You can specify their color space if you need to. In this case, only the base color is sRGB or gamma corrected. The rest should just be raw values because they're data maps. They're not maps that have to be gamma corrected for our viewing. And we'll export out these maps. It'll save them all out. And what we'll do, when export's done, we'll jump into Blender. Now in Blender, I'm just going to create a grid. So I'm going to go here and create a mesh and just create a grid. I'm going to give this grid a lot of subdivisions. So I'm going to go in here to add grid and I'll put it at 2048 by 2048 subdivisions. You might want to put it at something less if it's going to cause your computer to crash or get really slow, but this should be okay. It might just take a little bit of time to add those subdivisions. Once I've done that, I'm going to add a modifier. So I'm going to go here to this little wrench, add a modifier. The modifier I want to add is a displace modifier. So I'm going to add a displace modifier. I'm going to set that displace to use a new texture. That texture is going to be the height map. So I'm going to open up a texture, and that texture that I'm going to use is going to be my height map. So I'm just going to load that in. So I have that here, height map. Okay. And there it is. And this looks a little bit crazy right now, but it's using that height map to push out the vertices or the polygons of the surface to match what that map defines. And then we're going to change this or make sure the color space is either raw and not something different. And that will give us the proper correction of it. I think this is fine how it is. And it's obviously too strong, so I'm going to have to adjust that, but overall we're reading in the texture correctly. So I'll go back to the wrench here, and I can set the strength. So maybe a strength at 100 is just far too much. So we probably want to adjust that. So I'm going to pull that back down to a value that makes a little bit more sense, maybe 0.1, 0.2, something where it feels a bit better. Even that's too much. 0.05. Okay, that's a little bit better. Still probably could go lower, maybe 0.035. Okay, that feels good. So now we have all this detailed geometry here. Problem with it is it's very heavy. To cut down the heaviness, like you can't really reduce that. If you're going to want these details to be in here through the model, it's going to be heavy. But one thing that you can do to make this a little bit less heavy is I can collapse this displacement modifier down. So what I can end up doing is adding like a decimate on top of this displace. But before I do that, what I'll have to do is collapse this displacement down. Otherwise, it might not do the decimate correctly. So we could do that. We could go here and just apply it. And that will kind of bake it into the surface. Now I no longer can remove that displacement ever. So normally you might not want to do that. But usually when adding the decimate, I find that you sometimes have to do that. So if I add decimate, and I give it a minute, and maybe I should look at the wireframe. So currently, this is the wireframe. That's a lot of edges and vertices. So by setting a decimate node, it will remove flat surfaces or details from areas that don't really have anything. So like all the space where it's flat, it could remove all these vertices. So that could save us some geometry density. So I can just put a decimate node on here, or modifier, triangulate it, set the ratio to something really low. Ratio is like what percentage of triangles do you want to go to from its original. So original is 1. If I put at 0.1, it'd go down to 10% of its original geo. Maybe I'll do something like 0.05, 5% of the original geometry density we see here. And that will think a little bit and work away in the background. It might take a minute or so, but what it will give us is geometry that's much more optimized. And we'll still probably match the shape pretty well, and it might just be all that we need. So I'll give it a minute, and very soon we'll start to see the new geometry that it will generate. So it shouldn't be too much longer. And this can take a while. You know, its face count currently is like 4,190,000, and it's going to go to a very small fraction of that after this finishes doing its thing. So there we go. It just completed, and not too bad. It started to get rid of all that geometry that we don't really need. But when you look at it, it still pretty much maintains most of the shape. Maybe it gets a little bit kind of lower quality here, so maybe we can do 10% of its original geo instead of 5%. But now we have a high resolution mesh that we could use that goes along with our texture that we've created. So we've created a procedural texture that's adjustable. We can also create geometry from that if we needed to in certain cases. But the cool thing is we'd be able to go back into Designer, change these from circles to something different like a triangle, and have this all kind of update. And we didn't go too much into making all your nodes update and adapt to different shapes. That takes a little bit more work, but this starts to get you into the idea of how you can look at a photo, break it down into something that you can make more procedurally, and start going through that process. And then as you try harder and harder surfaces, go into a little bit more detail, make them more flexible, you can start to get some really powerful setups and kind of pre-made surfaces that you can adjust to a very detailed extent. So you're not always having to remake textures. You can create variations very easily. So this is how we can also create geometry from our procedural textures if you've properly created your height maps And from here, we could go and export this into Unreal using Nanite and get all the detail into Unreal as well. So it's really cool, really fun stuff to try out. And if you give that a try, you can also see in the PDFs that I actually do that. I throw it into Unreal, and you can see kind of how it looks there, a quick example of it. So if you are part of the Patreon, you'll be able to download this PDF, which goes over kind of all those steps that we went over in a little bit more detail in some cases, and kind of just a summary of everything. And if you're not part of the Patreon, but you still enjoy the videos, like and subscribe and comment below on what other videos you'd like to see.